Dean Martin's final interview occupies a bittersweet place in the memories of fans, and, especially, his family. Though he was known for effortless charm, cool confidence, and a trademark swagger that made him one of the most beloved entertainers of the 20th century, his last televised conversation revealed a more vulnerable man, one shaped by age, loss, and the quiet ache of a life lived largely in public. It left his family in tears, not because of anything dramatic, he said, but because of what it showed, the gentle dimming of a star who had once seemed unstoppable. In his prime, Dean Martin glided through interviews with a laid-back style that made audiences feel like they were sharing a drink with an old friend. He was witty without trying, evasive in a way that felt playful rather than guarded, and always ready with a sideways smile that suggested he had figured out the secret to life but wasn't about to spoil the joke. By the time of his final interview, however, that energy had changed. His voice was softer, his posture more fragile, and his responses carried the weight of someone who had lost more than he cared to explain. Much of the interview centered on reflection, something Martin rarely indulged in publicly. He spoke about the early days of his career, remembering the rough clubs, the small gigs, and the moment he realized he was meant to perform. What struck viewers, particularly his family, was the tone he used. Instead of laughing his way through stories of hardship, he recounted them slowly, almost tenderly, as if he were finally allowing himself to revisit memories he had kept locked away for decades. The humor was still there, flickering on occasion, but it came with a softness that hinted at both gratitude and fatigue. When he spoke about his partnership with Jerry Lewis, there was an unmistakable emotional undercurrent. He described the years they performed together as some of the most intense and exhilarating of his life. The breakup of their act, a subject he typically avoided or brushed aside with jokes, was mentioned with a surprising hint of sadness. He didn't criticize, complain, or place blame. Instead, he simply acknowledged that they had been young, ambitious, and overwhelmed by success. That gentle honesty caught his family off guard. They knew the subject was complicated and often painful for him, so hearing him confront it without deflection showed a vulnerability he rarely revealed. But the most powerful moment came when he spoke about family, his children, the people who had supported him, and the ones he had lost. He talked about fatherhood with a rawness that stunned those who knew him best. Dean Martin was never a man who wore his emotions openly. His cool persona was his armor. Yet in this interview, he lowered that shield. When he mentioned his son Dean Paul, who had died in a tragic plane crash years earlier, his voice broke just slightly enough for his family to recognize a grief that had never fully healed. It was the kind of emotional fissure that can be felt more than heard, and it made the moment almost unbearably intimate. His remarks about aging were equally moving. Martin admitted, with quiet resignation, that he no longer chased the spotlight. He spoke about solitude, about how life becomes simpler and more reflective as the years pass, and how he found comfort in silence rather than applause. This was not the legendary performer cracking jokes with a drink in hand. It was a man nearing the end of a long, extraordinary journey, acknowledging that the stage no longer belonged to him. His family later described this part of the conversation as the moment that brought tears to their eyes, not because he sounded defeated, but because he sounded at peace. Throughout the interview, his trademark humor surfaced here and there, but even his jokes carried a different tone. They were softer, wistful, almost nostalgic. It was as if he were performing for the last time, not for the audience, but for himself. Final bow, delivered with quiet dignity. What made the interview so emotionally powerful was not any single confession or dramatic revelation. It was the contrast between who Dean Martin had been in the public imagination and who he allowed himself to be in that moment. His family saw not the legend, not the public persona, but the real man, aging, reflective, wounded, and grateful. That honesty, after a lifetime of carefully crafted mystique, made the conversation unforgettable. Dean Martin's final interview was not a spectacle. It was a farewell, subtle, graceful, and deeply human, and that is why it left his family in tears.